It's really a pleasure to be here talking with you. I do wish that I were actually in Victoria. I mean, it's always nice to see people in person, and then Victoria, of course, is, as you said, my alma mater. But my sister also lives close to Victoria, and she just had a baby, so I am an aunt again. So I am really disappointed that I can't actually be there, although I think our weather is nicer today than yours is. So. The talk today is about strategies to reduce bias and discrimination in STEM. I really do want to make this a space where people, of all different ideas and all different backgrounds in EDI can have a conversation, can ask questions that they, those burning questions that they've been wanting to ask. And I really do hope to facilitate a discussion that can start at least after the talk, but will continue beyond that. So this is based on a paper that I just published along with two other people at my university, postdoctoral fellows, Devang Mehta and Alexandra Davis, and it's published in ACS Central Science. It's freely available for anyone who would like to read it to get more information. I also am happy to share slides with anybody afterwards. Just send me an email and I can send you the slides so you don't have to take pictures of the screen, which is what I generally do. Because I'm also giving a talk tomorrow, and I know that there are a lot of people who wanted to come to both, I modified the talks a little bit so that there's not a lot of overlap. And I'm hoping that people can get a lot out of both talks. So yeah, so jumping right in about this talk, which is about EDI, which is really about people and how we treat people. Tomorrow's talk about writing EDI statements is going to be about people, but also about science and how we do our science. So proper language in Canada. We have EDI, obviously equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm just going to put up my definitions so that we're on the same page. Equity is actually a really hard word to define, and if you look in the literature and around on the internet, it's a tricky one to pin down. I've defined it as providing people what they need to succeed, and so equity is not the same thing as equality. Equality is treating everyone the same. Equity recognizes that people are different and need different things in order to be able to succeed. So I always use the example of running a race where equality would be giving everyone the same size shoe, and equity is providing people the shoe size they need to run their best race. Intuitively, you can see which one of those is better. But I think equity goes beyond that a little bit. And it's about creating a system where all people can succeed. And I'll talk a lot about that later in the talk. So diversity is recognizing and valuing people's many differences. I have a list from the Canadian government of what they consider those differences to be, and it's everything that you would expect: race, place of origin, ethnicity, etc. And then inclusion is making sure everyone has the opportunity to participate fully. I'm actually going to take these out because you're not talking back to me, so I don't need them yet. But you're going to have to wave at me if you want me to stop, Fraser, because now I can't hear you. So inclusion is making sure everyone has the opportunity to participate fully. It is not the same thing as making sure everyone participates, but making sure that there is an environment where people feel comfortable being themselves and bringing their full selves to the table. And then we have racialization, or racialized person. So racialization is the process by which societies construct race as real, different, and unequal in ways that matter. It's an updated term from person of color or visible minority. Those don't necessarily work in all environments. Some of you may have heard the term BIPOC that comes from the US. There are also a number of problems with that term. So in Canada, racialization is the appropriate term. There are lots of reasons why diversity is important and why we should be paying attention to diversity in science. There's obviously a moral argument, but I'm not here to talk about morality. There is the argument that science affects people. It affects all people. You know, it affects our healthcare, it affects our environmental management. And right now we have a system where not all people have a say in what science gets done and how it gets done. And that's a problem, particularly at a university, which is funded by taxpayers. And so we have a problem, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about what the problem is. More of that will come tomorrow. But I do also want to point out how when you incorporate diversity and good EDI principles into labs, into departments, into universities, we actually do better science. And for me, everything is about the data. And so I want to show you a little bit of data. This one is about gender. It was done in the US in 2010. And in this study, what they did was to take 700 people, divide them into small groups, and to ask them to complete a variety of tasks. For example, a video game, an architectural design challenge. And the idea for the study was to figure out what was it that allowed the group to finish the task the fastest. Was it the average member intelligence? It was not. Was it the maximum member intelligence? So being a part of a group with the smartest person? Again, not. It was actually, there was a combination of things that went into getting those groups to finish the fastest, being the most effective. And they were social perceptiveness, parity and conversational turn taking, and the proportion of females in the group. This study was done in North America. In North America, in general, women are more likely to be trained from a very young age to be more socially perceptive, and groups with women in them, we know, are more likely to have parity and conversational turn taking. So everybody can participate in the conversation. And it's those things that allowed the groups to finish the task the fastest. And I think that this is important because it gets to this idea of really what science is. We are part of a team. We are part of a team within our labs. We're part of a team within our departments. You could even think of us as part of a team within society. And I think it's important, you know, if you think about a sports team, the sports team that wins the championship is not necessarily the one with the highest goal scorer or the best goalie, if we take hockey as an example. It's the team that works together the best, the team that really listens to one another. And I really want us to think about that when we think about science, what it means to work together well. I don't want to imply in any way that gender is the only important criteria. There's lots of data that also talks about ethnic and racial diversity, less data that talks about incorporating disability, and in science, virtually no data looking at LGBTQ+ in STEM, as far as I'm aware. I think there's a recent study, but I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. So diversity is important, but we don't have diversity. We don't have as much diversity as we ought to. And when I say we ought to, I mean, if we consider ourselves a tax-paying university, a public university, then we should probably reflect the public. And in Canada, 50% of the public is female, and 22% of the public is racialized. And of course, there are lots of nuances in there. Gender is not binary. Racialization is not the same for different racial groups. There's lots of nuance in there. But we do not have at our universities, certainly not at the faculty level, the kind of diversity that is reflective of the population. And I just want to show you one piece of data to demonstrate my point, because this is really well documented. So in this slide, this comes from NSERC's Women in Science and Engineering report that came out in 2017. And what they did was to look at one cohort of individuals who started grade 1 in 1991. 48% of these individuals were female. And again, they're just looking at gender as a binary, and it is not. In terms of graduating high school, 52% of graduates were female. But then the higher up the ladder you go, the higher attrition of women you see. So only 41% of bachelor's degree holders were female, 37% of master's, and 32% of doctoral degrees. So higher attrition, every level up the ladder you go. And it continues into the professoriate. You also see the same kind of thing reflected in industry, although to a slightly lesser extent. But the really important thing that I want to point out in this slide is that the percentage of women has not changed in 20 years. I think it's a really, really important point. The perception might be that we're getting better. And since the Me Too and Time's Up movements really brought this conversation into the mainstream public consciousness, it's possible. We don't yet have data though. And so I think this is a really important point, that what we're doing right now is not working. We need to be doing something different. We need intentional actions to be able to make a difference. This is for women, or rather for gender. We do not have good data for racialized students. I'll show you the little bit of data that we have tomorrow. We also have virtually no data for people with disabilities. We have a little bit of data here and there for Indigenous students. And as you might expect, in most places, Indigenous students are and faculty are underrepresented. And so the last real piece of data I want to show you before we get into how do we fix this problem is sort of a snapshot, a very small snapshot of where this problem is coming from. It's easy to fall into this trap of thinking, well, maybe these marginalized groups are not quite as good. And anyone who has actually spent time in this area knows that that is false. But we have a lot of data that backs that up, that tells us that the system in which we are currently working is biased in favor of certain demographics of people. And so I just want to show you this one study, actually two studies. This looks at bias in STEM hiring, and it's my favorite study because it's the first one that I found that really looked at bias in STEM in a scientific way. So what they did was to send out to 130 science professors in the US a resume of someone who had just finished their undergrad degree, wanted to go to grad school, but was applying for a research manager position. And they asked those professors to rank the applicant based on their competence, their hireability, and whether or not they were worthy of mentoring. And the only difference in these applications was that half were given the name John and half were given the name Jennifer. That was the only difference. And what they found was that the Jennifer was less competent with identical metrics, identical CV. She was less hireable. And in fact, her starting salary was about 85 cents on the dollar. So exactly what you might expect. This is what they said, the professor said the starting salary would be. And she was less worthy of mentoring. The important point in this study, and it's been replicated in many, many studies since then, is that faculty members' bias was independent of their gender, okay? This is the bias, and I'm going to come back to this in a second. This bias is being perpetuated by all of us because of the societal messages that we've grown up in. And again, I'm going to come back to this in a second because I think it's a really important point. So remember that women were also biased against the female candidate. The bias was independent of scientific discipline, independent of age and tenure status. So the younger generation is not doing a whole lot better than the older generation in this study. And again, this is pre Me Too movement. If you want to look outside of a study like this, this is a really great study that I really liked. They weren't actually looking at gender. What they were looking to do was to see if they could come up with a mathematical formula that would allow you to predict how long it would take someone to get their first independent faculty position. And it turns out that you can. Everything that you think goes into that does. The number of papers, the number of first author publications, the number of citations, etc. Only they had to factor gender into the equation in order to make the math work, because women with identical publication records were less likely to be hired than men. And then, because that was 10 years ago, this is a study that was published in 2019, in the summer of 2019, which shows the same sort of thing, except this study took it a step further. They're not just looking at gender, they're also looking at race. And so in this study, we still have the male-female names, but we also have white, Chinese, Black, and Latinx names. And this data comes right from the study. What you can see is that in most cases, women are still considered less competent than men. I should also point out, bottom is physics, top is biology. And we're looking at competence here. So in most cases, the women within a particular racial group are considered less competent than the men. There are some exceptions, especially in biology. But it's not equivalent across race. Different racial groups have very different experiences. And even within one racial group, people can have very different experiences. So this gets at this idea of intersectionality, which is that people have very different lived experiences and multiple different identities, multiple different identity groups to which they can belong. And it's important to remember that when we're thinking about people. Okay, so we have a problem. And this problem really comes from all of us. It comes from society and us as members of society. And how do we fix that problem? So I have my 10 things that I think that we can do in STEM to make a big difference in the lives of people from marginalized groups. So step one is to acknowledge your biases and your privileges. What we can achieve as individuals is based on, in my opinion, our inherent abilities, what we were exposed to as a young age, what we were encouraged to do, a lot of luck in many cases, minus the opportunity gap. And what I consider as part of the opportunity gap is socioeconomic background. We know that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds do not have access to as many opportunities. And we don't talk about that enough. In Canada and the US, socioeconomic background is frequently tied to race, which further exacerbates the problem of marginalization of racialized people. And then we have what I call overt discrimination. This is where one person actively thinks that they are better than somebody else for reasons of sex or gender or race. And unconscious bias. So unconscious bias, these are behaviors that are shaped by unintended biases, which every single one of us have because of repeated exposure to pervasive cultural stereotypes. So books, TV, music, movies, politics, news, conversations, we are bombarded constantly with these stereotypes, and they shape our perceptions in ways that we don't even know. And ironically, people who value their objectivity, like scientists, are more likely to fall prey to these biases, in part because they're not on guard against them. I want to point out two important things. One is that this is an unintended bias, and frequently your unintended biases, our unintended biases, I include myself in this, are directly contradictory to what we consciously value. Okay, I consider myself a smart, strong, successful woman, and yet my gut reaction is to think less of a smart, strong, professional woman. And so only by paying attention to these biases can we actually change our behavior. And that leads me to the second point that I want to bring up, that regardless of whether or not you intend to discriminate, you do, we do. We act in a way that discriminates, and our intent doesn't matter to the person on the receiving end of that. They still experience discrimination, and that's an issue. So every single one of us is biased. The different, cultures that we grew up in have different biases, and maybe some cultures have stronger biases in one direction as compared to others. It's incredibly variable, but every one of us is biased. Every one of us sitting in this room is also privileged. We are able to speak English, which is the mostly international language of science. We have time to come to a talk like this, time to consider something as important as this topic. And with privilege comes power. So some of us have more privilege than others, and some of us have more power than others. But I think it's really important to remember that each of us do have power to make a difference. For some of us, that power is only to make a difference within, our small circle of individuals, our social circle, our professional circles. Some of us have the power to make a difference on a larger scale. And I'm hoping that at the end of this talk, for every person, they will be able to see the things in here that they can change, that they can use their power to make a difference for others. So step 2 is to do your research, listen to your friends and colleagues, and then be vocal. It's really important to understand the situation before you're vocal. Not that you should understand it completely or be an expert on it, but you do want to make sure that when you are wading into a situation, you have some understanding of a way to do that without inflicting further damage. And so that's why I put do your research and listen to your friends and colleagues first before being vocal. So bias and discrimination occur all the time, every day. For people from marginalized groups, this is a constant barrage of you don't belong, you're not valued the same way others are, maybe you don't belong here. And that leads to feelings of isolation, discontentment, disenfranchisement, and that's not good. It's important, I think, to understand what bias looks like, what discrimination looks like, in order to be able to actually do something about it. And I have a list of things here that I've put into 4 groups. This is by no means an exclusive list. And some of these things could fall into multiple groups, but what I have is disrespect. So for example, interrupting someone mid-conversation, calling, we have lots of data of this one in particular, like calling women by their first name instead of their last name and title. Being called by your last name, your title and last name is associated with eminence and worthiness of funding. Being left out of group emails. This is clearly an old slide because I put another bullet point in here, having people mispronounce your name, which I'm sorry that I don't have in here. Lack of opportunities. So people from marginalized groups are less likely to be invited to speak, to be given funding. They're less likely to have access to insider information. This is information that is informal, that you get just because you're part of an in-group, whatever that major in-group looks like. And people who are outside of that in-group, the dominant group, don't generally have access to that insider information. This is information that you need to do your job. Who do you talk to in order to find out more information about hiring or about an award or something like that? That's insider information. Lack of acknowledgement. So people from marginalized groups are less likely to be given credit for their ideas. And then the double standard. This one is particularly important for women. There's a higher penalty for speaking up in groups, for risk taking, for essentially the higher up the ladder you go, the higher the expectations of your behavior are, and the more critical people are of you, especially if you do something that's considered a mistake. Okay, so that slide just had a few examples on it. There are lots of ways that you can get more information: books, movies, podcasts. Twitter has a great hashtag called Black and Ivory, and I think there's one, an Indigenous STEM one as well. These are people telling their personal stories, and they can be really moving. So there are lots of different ways that you can do your research. Going and talking to somebody from a marginalized group is sometimes okay, but it really depends on that person, because sometimes what you're asking that person to do is relive their trauma. And I use trauma specifically because experiencing this over and over again, some of them seem like small things, some of them are huge, but reliving them is frequently traumatic. So some people like talking about this kind of stuff because they want to get it out in the open, and for some people they just don't. It's really person dependent. So there are lots of information out there that you can access. And then listen to your friends and colleagues. They experience this. Marginalized people experience this all the time. And having somebody say, "I hear you," that sucks. I'm sorry that happened. Listening without judging, listening without rationalizing, just listening and validating that person's feelings has a profound effect on people's feelings of belonging. You can actually use this one, "I'm here to listen if you ever need to talk," sort of in advance. So my group, I've told them multiple times, you know, if you want to come to me to talk about something specifically with regards to this, I'm here to listen. And that can initiate the conversation. And then be vocal. It is incumbent on all of us to speak up, to act, to do things, to change the situation in which we find ourselves, so that everybody has the opportunity to participate fully. And again, those of us with more power have potential to have a bigger effect, and really we can do a lot of things to make a difference in a short period of time. So these are mostly comments in a social situation. It doesn't have to be combative, it doesn't have to be aggressive, just, do you know that that's not appropriate anymore? And then this one, of course, I'm really sorry, because as you go down this road of EDI and being vocal, sometimes you're going to screw up. I've screwed up. I'm really sorry. Didn't realize my comments could be interpreted that way. That's on me. Now I know, and I will do better. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Okay, be strategic about who you work with. That goes for trainees. As you are looking for a place to work, ideally, I know it's not possible in some cases, but ideally you want to work in a group where you will be seen for who you are, where you will be valued for who you are. And I encourage people where they can to ask questions of places where they're going to work to see if that is the case. Coming from the other side of the things, from the hiring side of things, there are lots of things that we can do, and we'll talk a lot about these tomorrow, because this is a key part of writing an EDI statement, is talking about hiring. So I'm not going to go through these in great detail today, just to say, in designing the position, make sure the committee includes diversity and allies, people who will make sure that those diverse voices are heard and valued, not given extra administrative tasks, not overburdening those people who already are burdened with a lot because they are underrepresented with extra work. Make the position description broad, so that you are potentially bringing in pulling from a larger group of people. There's nothing more frustrating seeing a job ad that is so specific. It's almost like they have a particular person in mind. In advertising the position, I just want to emphasize this one: have an EDI statement and require it from candidates. So when you have an EDI statement, you're saying that we value EDI and that we are working to create an environment that is more inclusive. And when you require it from candidates, you are hiring people that value that and that are going to work with you to make change. Creating the shortlist. The first thing that you want to do is do some bias training. Remind yourself that you're biased so that you can hopefully look at the applications in as unbiased a way as possible, and then check the shortlist to make sure that diversity is represented and that you haven't perpetuated your bias. There's really good evidence that getting a really diverse shortlist increases the odds of a person from a marginalized group getting hired. And then interviewing, there are lots of things that you can do. Having applicants interviewed by more than one person reduces bias. There's lots of data for this. There's data for this one too. Asking candidates a set list of questions. One of the things that we do when we interview people is we are looking for fit, and fit is a disaster for EDI, because what you're asking for with fit are people who laugh at the same jokes that you do and get the same cultural references that you do. Those people are more likely to look like you. And so by having a set list of questions that you ask of every candidate, you're giving every candidate the opportunity to provide you with the same information. Step number 4 is to restructure hiring, retention, and advancement programs. We know we have a major problem in leadership with regards to even further underrepresentation of marginalized individuals. And so by restructuring these programs, we can start to fix this problem. So making starting salaries consistent and non-negotiable. There are some places like UBC Science that have done this, or have a negotiation coach, someone who's not part of that committee who can help the applicant through that process and make sure that people are not being penalized because of their, not just their inability to negotiate. We know that women negotiate less than men, but we also know that women who do negotiate just as well as men are also penalized because that's outside of an expectation of behavior. So for some, it's a no-win situation, and having that leadership negotiation coach can help. Have a formal onboarding process for new faculty, staff, and students. When I was a graduate student, I wrote the Graduate Student Survival Guide, and it was a list of things. It was a booklet for new graduate students telling them exactly how to navigate their graduate school experience, where to get help when you needed it, who had keys when you needed them, that kind of thing. One of the things that we do in my department now is that once a month, the chair of my department, has a meeting with all of the assistant professors as a group over lunch. And we talk about, what are the things we're experiencing? We can answer one another's questions. We have access to leadership. The chair now knows how the assistant professors are doing, and we can get some answers about how things work at the university. It's incredible. It also builds community across different fields within the assistant professorship, and I'm hoping it's going to lead to a more cohesive department. Restructure promotion and tenure. There was a great paper that just came out, which is on my website if you want to look at it, about how to fix the issue of student teaching evaluations. I strongly recommend that people do that, not just teaching of faculty, but also teaching evaluations for TAs, requiring EDI statements and valuing service. And then lastly, start a mentorship group for people from marginalized groups who might be interested in leadership positions in 3 to 5 years, to help them learn the tools that they would need to get into those leadership programs. Because right now, the way that we're doing it, which is just, if you're interested in a leadership position, apply and maybe you'll get in, that's not working. Number 5 is to generate a code of conduct as a team. We do this within my lab, and my code of conduct is on my website. I didn't write it, my trainees wrote it. I said, I think we need this. We need a shared vision for how we're going to treat one another. We need a shared vision for what we value as a group. And they went away and came back with something, and we workshopped it in lab meeting. And now we go back to it every year, at least once a year, to make sure that it still says what we want it to say and it still reflects our ideals. And every single person who applies to me, I also ask, have you read the code of conduct? What are you going to do to uphold those values within the lab environment? My department has just written something like this, a kind of a code of conduct for the department. And I think it's absolutely spectacular. It's less about talking about how we're going to act and more about acknowledging our issues and our vision for the future. And it is going to be a roadmap for EDI initiatives, data-driven EDI initiatives to try to make things better in the future. Okay, number 6, we're getting to the end. Be inclusive. So being inclusive means creating that environment where everyone can participate. So there are lots of ways to do this. Considering food allergies, considering timing of meetings. I don't know what it's like at UVic, but at the University of Alberta, 25% of our graduate students are parents. And that goes up for postdocs and for faculty. So figuring out timing of meetings is really important. Saying, you are a valued member of this team, please tell me how I can modify this activity so that you feel comfortable participating. I want you to participate because I value your input. Thanks for volunteering to organize the group lunch. Can you check to see if there are any food allergies in the group that might dictate where we can go? Maybe it's Eid or Lent or something like that, and people aren't eating during the day, or they've got reduced, they have additional dietary restrictions. Asking that person, is it okay to have an event? Is there a way that we can modify this event? Should we be doing something non-food related? I really want to point out, and this is one of these situations where you need to understand the field before you jump in. The instinct might be to say, okay, this person is not eating during the day, during this particular time frame, therefore we can't have food. And that is taking the decision, that's taking the power out of that marginalized person's hands. That is not what we want to do. We want to ask that person, we want to give them the authority to say yes or no, or maybe we can do this without food. Is there a way to modify the activity? Or maybe I'm totally okay with you having food. This is a normal part of what I do every year, so it's totally okay. But giving that person the voice is key. And then we talked about time and being a parent. Be intentional. We need to be intentional in what we do to make sure that we are not perpetuating discrimination and discriminatory practices. So, for example, this one actually happened to me. It's happened to a lot of people that I know, where as scientists, we're in a professional environment, but it's also a very social environment. And especially when you're a grad student, and to a certain extent as an undergrad student as well, there's a very, very blurry line between personal and professional lives in many cases. And sometimes what happens is that scientific activities get conceived of in those social interactions. And then it comes back into the lab, and the people who were not part of the social group are now excluded from the professional activity. And that's not okay. So, two grad students come to you with an idea that they cooked up over beers, that they want to write a review article, but I think you should include the person who didn't get to go out for beers. Because she has expertise in the subject area, not as a handout, but she has legitimate expertise in that subject area and really should be involved. Ordering, someone's been doing the ordering, the administrative tasks, the things that are extra time burdens, but don't come with any extra prestige or they don't help your career along, they actually hinder it. paying attention to that within your lab and within your department. Who is doing the note-taking role in the meetings? Who is the chair of the meeting? Who's getting lots of credit for being chair, but maybe not doing quite as much work as the note taker. I don't want to go through each of these in detail. We talked about pronouncing the name correctly. This person is already on hiring and awards committee. It's not appropriate to ask her to do more service. So it's about speaking out and being intentional. Number 8 is to be supportive. Not just when things happen, but in an environment that disproportionately negatively affects certain groups of people. So we can't use that idea because of X, Y, Z, but thank you for throwing it out there. I value your creativity and participation. Please keep participating. Please keep putting your ideas forward because they're important. Participating is important. So this is one of those things that you can actually say, and then these are the things that you can do. Talking to new students about social belonging and growth mindset so that they feel less of that inferiority. Everyone around me seems so smart, so I'm automatically dumb. Talking about social belonging and growth mindset is supportive. Creating a family room so that new parents have a place to go if they're breastfeeding, or if a caregiver is bringing in a newborn. Maybe there's some toys for the 2-year-old, so that that transition back to work is less traumatic for the person who has to come back to work, and helps keep that family dynamic solid. Provide feedback that's focused on the applicant's skills. Be careful of underestimating the potential of people from marginalized groups. Be vocal in your support of leaders from marginalized groups, because again, they experience higher criticism. So these are just, small things that you can do. There are so many of them. Number 9 is to rethink the status quo. We've been doing things a certain way for a long period of time. And I found this quote by this person, Admiral Grace Hopper, who was an admiral in the US military. I don't know if admiral is Navy or what. But what she said is the most dangerous phrase in the language is, "We've always done it this way." And I think it's really, that is profound. I hope she's the one who actually said it. I extensively looked on Google. I was hoping it was actually her. But are our practices serving our people? Is there a way we can do this better? Our publishing, our award system, how we select grad students, rethinking the status quo. And then the last one is making action a habit. Regularly discussing EDI. There's tons of evidence that says that showing up to one of these talks once a year or twice a year changes behavior for about 24 to 48 hours and then nothing. So regularly discussing this is the only thing that is going to help us reevaluate how we're doing. Valuing EDI work. A lot of the people who are doing work in this area are from marginalized groups, and it is an added burden on top of everything else. Actually valuing it for promotion and tenure or for scholarship applications, whatever, creating awards for people who are trying to make a difference, I think is really important. So the key thoughts then are to start small. I have told you so many things that we can do. And the magnitude of the problem can feel overwhelming, frequently feel overwhelming. And I think I know there's really good evidence that small changes can have a massive effect. And so even doing, small things can make a difference in the lives of people from marginalized groups. So start small, do something this week. Well, it's Thursday, do something next week, and then do something the week after. And make sure you track your progress so that you are holding yourself accountable. Be ready to feel uncomfortable when you come up against, especially when you come up with your own biases. Recognizing that you are part of the problem can be really, really hard. And so be ready to feel uncomfortable and then reward yourself for working through those difficult subject areas. And that's all I have to say on that. So thank you very much for your attention.